Hi guys, and welcome back to Scalemotor. Sorry, it's been a while. I've had loads of things going on, which I'll go over in my next bench update, which should be soon. But today we're going to carry on with the YZF-R1, and this is the final part. We're going to be doing the fairings. We're going to be painting, decaling, and then putting everything together. We'll also be installing the lights. So that's exciting. But first things first, what we're doing is just trying to get the fairings to fit. The fit wasn't great from the kit. And of course, they're held on by screws. And we've opted to use magnets here. So getting them to fit flush wasn't the easiest. So all I'm doing now is lining up the magnets for the fairings. I've already attached the magnets to the engine and the frame. And we're just popping the magnets in through these holes just to make sure they line up nicely. We'll check the parallel just to make sure that bottom is exactly where it needs to be. Next up, the mid fairings. I've glued a strip of styrene along the bottom because there was a little gap between the bottom and the top. The sides are originally one piece, so I've cut them just to make it more realistic, but there was a gap. So I've glued a piece of styrene and I'm using the UMP sanders there just to sand away to get clearance, because there were clearance issues because there's a couple of 3D printed parts underneath. So next up, we're moving on to primer, and I dropped the bottle on purpose there. Just wanted to make sure everything was shaken up nicely. But we're going to apply the primer as always. We're going to start with a nice thin coat, and we're going to angle the part to the light just so we can make sure that we're getting the coverage that we want. We just want a nice thin coat to start, and then for subsequent coats we'll go a little thicker, and then we'll build it up until we get a nice coverage. It can be hard sometimes to see exactly how good your coverage is when you're priming white plastic with a white primer, but I wanted to use the white primer because I'm going over this with a white paint, a thin white paint. So if I used a black or a grey, it'd take a lot more to cover. I'm using zero paints, and I like to leave at least 5 minutes in between coats for that to dry. And you know, if I needed more coats, then that's longer drying time, and it takes so long. So just angle the parts to the light to make sure you're hitting where you need to hit, and you should be fine. Just backflowing there to make sure it's still nice and mixed up. And then we're on to UMP black primer. This is the gloss black primer, and this is my favourite primer. But we're using this for the rest of the parts, so anything that's going to be metal, anything that's going to be black or plastic on the bike. I say plastic, I don't mean the fairings, I mean like there's black infill panels which I'm painting here. But anyway, we're going to go over the same way we did with the white, a nice thin coat, and then for subsequent coats, we're gonna go a little heavier. In total, with both primers, I think I've done 4 coats, and that should be enough to get a nice primer layer down for your paints. As you can see, I was having some issues with the primers, but that's purely my fault. I hadn't washed the airbrush out well enough, and I was previously using a lacquer-based paint. And the water-based UMP primers can react a little with lacquer thinner or lacquer paints, so just keep an eye on that. So here we are, we're using the Zero Paints Yamaha R1 set. And you have to shake the living bejesus out of these just to make sure everything's mixed, because there's a lot of thinner in there. I did cut out about 2 minutes of shaking. They've been sitting a while, so all the pigment had time to settle at the bottom, so So yeah, just make sure you shake them up a lot, but be careful because the glass jars, I have heard, can smash with that shaker ball inside. So now this paint is a very, very hot paint, so you want to be very, very careful with it. Do a super thin layer. It's really hard to see the layer now because I'm painting white on white again. You'll see later on with the red just how thin of a coat that I do. And I think with the white I've done about 7 or 8 coats in total, leaving at least 5 minutes between each coat for the paint to off gas, just so you know I don't end up crazing or melting any plastic. Here we go, and now we're coming in with the red. You'll be able to see now just how thin I do go with these coats. So it's straight out of the bottle, not thinned at all. I'm not sure of my airbrush pressure, but I'm using the UMP Apex with a 0.35 needle. And as you can see here, I am barely putting any paint down. I just want to give it a kind of red tinge, just so you can see that the paint is going on. And just make sure you cover all the areas. Try and get in all the nooks and crannies and the dips and everything now and with each layer, because you don't want to realize later on that you've not really covered a bit, because then you're putting loads of layers on top of your layers you've already done, which can alter the color slightly. So just try and make sure you get a nice even coverage, because it is a thin paint as well. The more you put on, the more chance you have of actually changing the color slightly. But yeah, we're just going to make sure we get everything with a nice thin coat. I went a bit thicker on the inside because I wasn't too bothered if I crazed the inside a little bit, because that's going to be weathered a lot. But again, we're leaving about 5 minutes between each layer. With the red, I think we got to 9 coats in total, but it's a shame with the zero paints that they are hot, and you've got to be really careful because they do some fantastic colours. Like this is pretty much spot on to the actual colour of the bike. So I would suggest using them, but be careful and practice first on scrap, just to get your technique right. Make sure this scrap styrene. You don't want to be testing it on cardboard, because you're going to end up with because the different materials will react differently to the paint. So just test it on some scrap styrene. Just build up the coats, but just be careful because each bottle is potentially different. The thinner is not really consistent, I've noticed, through the whole range. But next up, we're going to do some metalizing using these Uschi van der Rossum metalizing buffing powders. So essentially all I'm doing is dipping a cotton bud in and just rubbing it over the UMP gloss black primer. These do work a lot better on a glossy black base, but that's all there is to it. You pop it on and you buff it up. For parts of models which are going to be handled, I would suggest a clear over the top. I haven't used any, but I've been told that alcad clear works, aquagloss works great, because this stuff is just a powder. It gets absolutely everywhere and it's easy to rub off afterwards. As you'll see, my fingers get absolutely covered in the stuff, and I had to, the second I finished, I went and washed my hands before I continued with any other model building, because you will leave graphite-y fingerprints everywhere. But I'm just keeping on coming back and buffing up just to make sure it's all it's all covered and it's all as shiny as we can get it. I didn't bother clear coating these parts because they're going to be behind the lenses for the front lights and they're never going to be touched after I've installed the lights. And there you can see it's absolutely all over my fingers. With this stuff I'd suggest having some paper down, which is why I done it with the paper I used to paint on. Because if you get a bit on your bench and you don't notice, you can rub your hand through it, rub your finger through it, not notice, and you'll put fingerprints in your lovely new paintwork. So next up we're going to be doing some decaling. There's not many difficult decals on this at all, really. Most of them go down on a nice flat surface or a slightly curved surface, and they sit quite nice. So start off as usual with the decals. We're going to be using the micro set. We're just going to put a little layer of this on where we're going to put the decals. You don't want too much, just a nice kind, just so you can see the area is a little wet. And then we're going to pull the decal out of the water. I always pop it on the back of my hand, just I don't know why. But yeah, I'm just going to give it a little wiggle to see if it's moving. If it's moving, we'll come in with the tweezers and then just pop it on where we've put that micro set, and then we're going to get it into position. Some people don't like using their fingers for decals, and that's totally fine. I don't mind using my fingers as long as they're wet. It doesn't really, I don't have any issues. But once it's in place, we're just going to get our cotton bud now, and we're just going to roll it over the top just to push out any excess moisture, just to make sure that decal is sitting on our part rather than on a film of micro set. You want to make sure you've got all of the excess out from underneath, because it can cause issues with the decal setting, or it can, if you miss it and you go on to clear coat, it can cause issues with your clear coat. And we're just going to repeat the same process for the other side of the fender, the front fender. Try that one again. As you can see, it's exactly the same process. Just want to make sure it's the right way up. So again, coming in with a micro set, popping the decal on, and then we're just going to roll out any excess moisture. You want to roll the cotton bud rather than push it, because you can move the decal, and then sometimes it'll kind of stick in place, and you have to apply more micro set or water or try and pick it up just to move it back. But then we're going to come in with microsol, which is a decal softener. And we use this just to soften the decal, just so it kind of melts into place a little, just so it looks more like it's on the surface rather than sitting above the surface. It'll soften it and make it conform to the surface a little more. Next, we're moving on to the side fairings, and again, nothing really difficult here. The only kind of thing to watch out for is the placement of these YZF logos. Now I was using reference. I had my tablet next to me with a picture of my bike on. So my actual bike, I painted and done the fairing decals myself in real life. So while the decals on the bike might not be true to the original bike, I'm making a model of my bike. So if they are slightly off, if you do notice they are slightly off, I do apologise. That's my fault for messing it up on the 1:1 scale version. I think they're pretty close though. But we can do the same thing. We've applied some micro set. We're going to roll our cotton bud over just to make sure we get out any excess microset or any water or anything that's left over, and then we're going to do the same for the Delta Box and X-Up logos at the bottom. But first we're going to stop and have a little snack. Can't beat these little bags of party rings. A mid decaling snack, it's always good. But yeah, we're going to move on to the Delta Box and the X-Up logo at the bottom of these fairings. And again, exactly the same process we've been following the whole time. I'm not sure why that time I opted to slide it off rather than pick it off. Might be all the sugar from the party rings messing with my mind. Again, some super easy decals. The R1 logos on the back fairing there, the tail fairing. I didn't record it all just because I didn't want to bore you with super simple decals over and over again. This one was nice and easy to do. Just get it nice and centered, and we're going to follow the same process with the microset first, and then the microsol. So as far as difficult decals go, I'd say this front one was the most difficult. Now you can mask and paint it. In hindsight, I probably would have, just because of the effort I went through to do this, whereas 2 strips of masking tape would have done me good. So yeah, we decided to slide this one on just because I didn't want it folding and sticking to itself, which can be a bit of a nightmare. So we just slid the bottom end off the backing paper, held it on the model with a wet thumb just to make sure it's where it needs to be, and then we just pulled the backing paper off. So with this one we applied the micro sol quite liberally, and then we let it sit for 5 minutes, and then we come back, made sure it was in the right place, rolled any excess out, a bit more, just keep doing that until you've got it where it needs to be. It's a bit finicky, but it will sit nice once it's kind of softened. And then we were on to clearing. We're using the GX112, and just because I could, I wrote the thinning ratios and everything down on the piece of paper next to me, and that was under my arm, so I can't really remember. I believe what we done was 70% MLT, so Mr. Leveling Thinner, and 30% of the GX112. And then we're just going to slowly build it up and giving it a couple of minutes in between layers to off gas slightly. Towards the end I was a bit liberal with it, and that's just because on my actual bike I actually 2K'd the fairings with an Amazon spray gun in the back garden, and I went far too thick, so there are some runs. So I wasn't too worried about getting runs here because it would look kind of accurate, I suppose, because I messed it up in full scale, so may as well mess it up in 12th scale. We didn't really have a problem though. We didn't get any runs. I did put it on quite thick towards the end, but I think we got away with it. So next up, we came on to a bit of lighting. Now I had these LEDs just sitting around, so I decided I was going to use them for the rear lights rather than using some white LEDs and painting the lenses clear red and hoping for a nice colour, and now using these, they're going to be red. So we just soldered them in series. So we soldered one leg, the positive leg of one to the negative leg of another, so one anode to a cathode. You don't really need to know a lot about electronics and circuits and whatnot to do something like this. You can buy LEDs pre-wired with resistors, which my front ones are, but these ones, like I said, I just had sitting around. I knew they'd be red. They did require me to do a bit of maths just to work out what type of resistor I would need to use to not pop my bulbs using a 12-volt battery. But like I said, the front ones are pre-wired with resistors. I did have to, they have heat shrink over them, so I had to cut that back just to find out the value of those resistors, and to see if they'd be any good. So then I done some fancy maths, which I learned about in college, then forgot about, and then reread online as I was doing this, because I realised I'm going to need some resistors. Yeah, I'm not going to regurgitate maths to you because I'm sure you're not interested, and to be honest, I can't really remember what I'd done. I just know I ended up with a resistor of the right value and nothing exploded, which is always a positive. So yeah, I would suggest doing a little bit of reading if you are going to go down this route, but I promise it is not super duper involved, and it's not hard at all. So don't be put off by the fact that you might have to work out the value of your resistor. Most LEDs are the same anyway. Red LEDs will generally have the same forward voltage and whatnot. I'm gonna stop talking about this stuff now because it's probably boring a lot of people. It's boring me. But anyway, when it comes to soldering as well, it's not hard. It can be hard to get a really nice, clean looking job, but as long as you've got a connection, you're golden. I am by no means an expert at soldering or any of this electronics malarkey, but I managed to make it work. The soldering I've got, I bought a long time ago when I was more into electronics and things. You can just get a cheapy one from Amazon or the corner shop, wherever. But yeah, you can find plenty of videos online about soldering. I'd suggest watching one or two if you are going to go down this route. So yeah, now we've got all that boring technical stuff out of the way. We're on to fitting the lights into the model now. This was a little bit of a squeeze. I hadn't thought about this beforehand when I decided to use these bulbs. I didn't check for clearance. Luckily they fit, and we were able to get them in. And they're going to be covered by the seat. Now it was at this point I realised I need a switch. I didn't have one, and I was in town the day after this. I saw some tea light candles and I thought, you know what, I'll buy them. They'll come with some batteries which I can use in the future, and there'll be switches in them. I brought them home, took them to bits, and the switches weren't a sealed unit. They were just like a sliding bit of plastic and some plates of metal, so I couldn't really salvage them, which is quite annoying. But I got some cool flickering LEDs if I want to use them for any dioramas or anything in the future. So the whole point of me telling you the story of the switch was to explain why I've just got random wires flowing out to the side of the model, and that was just so I could connect the battery up to test it until I did get a switch. So now we're fitting the front lights. These are those pre-wired ones. I got them from Amazon. Just if you search online for SMD LEDs, you'll find loads of tiny little LEDs, and a lot of them will come pre-wired with resistors, which is great, and they'll tell you the voltage they need. Like these are 12 volt ones, which is why I'm using 12 volt batteries. But I've drilled holes in these little kind of light surrounds, and I'm using 5-second fix UV curing resin to fit the bulbs in place. And it's super simple. You just put a blob on and you shine a UV light on it 5 seconds, as the name suggests, and you've got a nice hold. And the reason I'm using this is because it dries clear and it won't dry foggy, or it's not going to get in the way of the light. So you want to use something clear. You could use white glue. It's just, you know, this is a pretty much instant fix and it's done, job done. And you can use it for lenses and stuff. That's what I used for the indicator lenses, because I 3D printed some indicators. And now we're just going to test the lights and make sure that the light comes through, and it does, so we're good to go. Now with all the lights in place and the fairings on, we just needed to do a little test, and as you can see my red lights at the back light up without exploding. Excellent. And these are those wires I was talking about, because they didn't have a switch, and you can see the front lights also light up. Perfect. Nothing's pinched, nothing broke, and my solder joints were good. So now we're connecting the indicators, and I realised at this point that there's a little plastic plate where the indicators connect, and I'd forgot to paint that on. So I'm just using the Tamiya XF85, I believe, rubber black to simulate that, and then we're just gonna pick up one of the 3D printed indicators, dab the end in the glue, and then we're just gonna hold them in place for a couple of seconds and make sure they stick nicely. We repeat this for 2 on the front and 2 on the back. These were modelled after my actual indicators on the bike, which are just cheapy Amazon sequential flashing indicators. I got them because the bulb indicators, which were originally on the bike when I got it, were aftermarket and they weren't very good. So I opted for LEDs. Okay, now we're just going round the fairings. Everywhere there was a moulded in bolt head we removed, and we drilled a small 0.5mm hole, and we're just using some Top Studio rivets in place of those moulded in bolt heads. It's just another one of those little tiny details which can set a model off, in my opinion. I think we used 12 or 14 of these rivets in total. Be careful, they are very small, and if you're picking them up with tweezers like I am, you can end up flinging some across the bench and losing them. It's really annoying when you lose them, because 2 months later, when you're not looking for them, you'll find them. I do apologise, I'm slightly off camera. Between last video and this video, I moved my room around, so my camera mount has moved position, and I've had to mount my light a different way, which has kind of put my whole kind of recording setup at a slight at a slight different angle, and I'm not really used to it, so I do keep on going out of shot. So I do apologise for that. I will keep an eye out for it in the next video. So now we're moving on to some weathering, and I am thoroughly enjoying weathering recently. We're using UMP Pigments here. These are absolutely excellent. They're very, very fine, so you can get a very stark effect if you wish, or you can get a subtle effect. If you're just doing a small subtle effect, I suggest just using a little bit out of the lid. If you're going for a really dark effect, then just dip your brush in the pigments. This is an old brush, so I would suggest using an old brush because they would be a nightmare to clean out with a brush. I haven't tried. And I'd always suggest using some paper because they're so fine, much like the Uschi powder we were using earlier. You cannot notice it falling on your bench or on your cutting mat, and you rub your hand over it and it's all over your hand and you won't notice, and then you'll have black smudges all over the house, and you'll be baffled wondering where they came from. And I'm speaking from experience. I'm also, as you can see, using a cotton bud to apply it. I've mixed it in a little bit of water just to help kind of carry it. And then when the water evaporates, it'll kind of stick to where it needs to go. You would need a bit of thinner to kind of fix it properly because the water won't fix it excellently. I opted to wipe off the bits left on the fairing because even though my bike was dirty, it wasn't that dirty. So I wiped off the bits I done on the fairing, and I opted for this method where I'm using some very, very thin UMP black primer, and it's thinned down quite a lot with water just to make it really, really runny and really watery. I'm using the airbrush to slightly apply it to the front, and then using the air from the airbrush to push it along the fairings as if it's been dirty and going through the air. And then the very last thing we did was we soldered on a switch. I ended up buying some switches online just so I could have a switch and not have a model with two wires poking out the side constantly. And the switch is very simple to wire in. You just kind of break your circuit and then solder one wire to one leg and another wire to another leg. I suggest testing it first because some switches are different, but the majority of them will work if you solder one to the middle and one to one of the ends. And there we are, one final test before our final photos. You can see the switch works lovely, and you can tell I've got a new cutting mat because my old one was melted from solder, covered in pigment, and it was buckled, which really, really annoyed me. So I had to get a new one. And here is finished model and the actual bike. I'm chuffed with how it came out. I really am. Here's some fancy pictures I took with the fancy camera where you can see quite a bit of the weathering. Yeah, I have really, really enjoyed this build. I've enjoyed the weathering. I've got a bit overboard. My bike is dirty, but it's nowhere near this bad. You can see some rusty pipes there. You can see some of the 3D printed details here. I've done the key and the phone holder. Yeah, like I said, I've absolutely loved it. I have gone overboard in some places with the weathering, but that's just so it kind of brings it out in scale. The rust, again, a bit overboard in some places, but I am thoroughly pleased with the outcome. Take some atmospheric photos with a bit of smoke now with the lights on, just so you can see the light. Yeah, love it. There's some finishing touches like my actual license plate and the exhaust logo. You can see the logo, the Lextech logo on the exhaust there. And this is the bike next to my very first model I built, which was the same colour scheme, obviously inspired by the fact that I had this bike. And that brings us to the end of another build. If you have enjoyed, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day and stay safe.